Welcome to Life in Focus. In today's episode, we're talking about opioids and specifically the opioid crisis in the UK and where cannabis-based prescribed medicines currently fit within our healthcare model. We have a really interesting and quite deep chat about medicine in general and people's health and people's well-being. We also talk a lot about the endocannabinoid system and how it works. How is it that medical cannabis interacts with our experience of pain? I'm joined by Karen Sharp, who's the Managing Director of Lyphe, and I'm also joined by Chris Tasker, who is the CEO and founder of Global Cannabinoid Solutions. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Thanks for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Okay, so this is a subject that feels very close to my heart because I spent a lot of time working in drug treatment services, and in drug treatment services, I saw lots of opiate-related harm. And the study that we're kind of opening this discussion up with was a King's College London study, which showed that between 2011 and 2022, there were 39,232 opioid-related deaths. And that was a 54.7% increase than was previously thought. To give some broader context around opioid use in the UK, there are 8 million adults with chronic pain, and of those 8 million adults say that their pain is moderate to severely disabling, and we know that the overwhelming majority of those people will be prescribed opiates because that's the kind of default, that's the kind of go-to treatment. So we have an issue with opiates in the UK. Those deaths, those 39,000 deaths, no doubt the overwhelming majority are for people that access treatment services. But we know from those numbers that it can be a very problematic drug. As we're going to have a conversation today around how cannabis-based prescribed medicines fit into the mix. And I kind of want to open things up with just a question as to why are opiates the default prescribed option, and kind of what do you see at the clinic, Karen, around opiates?
We see a lot of our patients. So I would say that probably 70% of our patients at Lyphe now are coming to us for pain-related conditions that have historically been using opioids and want to look at a more natural remedy of relief. So they're coming to us with the view that we will then titrate them down whilst using cannabis as a modulator to get them pain-free.
I imagine most of those people have been sat on opiates for a long time.
A long time. Yeah, we've seen patients that have been using opioids for 5-10 years and, not just taking an opioid, but taking something to protect their stomach and maybe something additionally. And actually they're fed up with rattling around and actually want to use or try something else that is better for their body. It's going to take away their pain, but it's actually going to be better all round. So we do see a lot of that.
So, Chris, it kind of sounds like one of the consequences of long-term opioid use is also, the risk of using opioids in itself, but also the fact that you have to use many other medications alongside the opioid to kind of manage the side effects. Is that kind of the case?
Interesting, I guess, relationship balance that you've got to find as a patient and also as a doctor. Your body does almost acclimatise to whatever treatments that you're giving it, and depending on the pain disorder, you can keep adding opioids until you're taking tremendous doses, and then you find it becomes quite a slippery slope of you just keep stacking pain, trying to numb yourself or get the relief, and that unfortunately transpires into a whole host of different sort of secondary issues, either with potential addiction, polypharmacy, adverse effects, drug-seeking behaviours. And so I can absolutely sympathise with doctors who've got patients coming to them who are still in excruciating pain, and a lot of the conventional treatments that we have at the moment don't quite push the right buttons in the body to give some of those patients the relief they want.
Yeah, what I saw in treatment around consequences of long-term opioid use, or just opioid use in general, was what you just talked about there, is the tolerance effect. So someone would I am in pain, I'll use a drug, alleviate the pain. But you can become tolerant to that and then want more and more and more. And obviously, my experience of opioid use was in drug treatment, where you would have people who are using it chronically and problematically to often cover up trauma, deal with emotional pain, and physical pain, but mainly to start with, it would be emotional pain and emotional trauma. And you would look at their kind of history of use, and it would just go up and up and up and up and up, up and up. Be like, they were never just like, oh yeah, I use this amount and then I stay at that. It often spikes and climbs, and then other drugs are kind of thrown into the mix. Why do we think that people are kind of so used to using opioids despite the risks that they have? I guess it's kind of like a bit of a normalisation of high opioid use clinically.
I think that when you first are prescribed it, you're looking for that relief and you are trusting in who's providing you that medication. And to a point, it works. And then it works, and then you might take a bit more, and it works, and then suddenly you're building it up. And after, a period of time, it's like everything, you become reliant on it, don't you? And it's not having the same effect that it once did. Mm. So I think it's, you have faith in your provider that's issuing you that prescription, and it works. But, there's different ways. You've got pain and chronic pain, but then there's also the psychological pain. And where do you go? Do you keep putting a pill over that? Yeah. It's like putting a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
Or do you have to get to the root cause? But again, in the world that we live in now, we don't have the resources. Yeah. We don't have the time to spend with people to dig deeper, and it's, we can send somebody to a pain clinic, but actually you might be waiting 18 months to get that appointment. And what do you do in the meantime?
Yeah. Well, that's what I would see that in treatment services all the time, is particularly for that emotional pain, emotional trauma. It'd be like the opioid, in most cases it was heroin, was dealing with like an emotional pain. And what really needed to happen was like, well, let's deal with that emotional pain. But their lifestyle and the opioid use would just make that very difficult to kind of get down to what that is. So it would just be so traumatic or so challenging that it wasn't a conversation where someone could be like, oh yeah, fine, I'll just go to a talking therapy, and it'll kind of magically disappear.
People don't have the time, and people don't have the money. Some people can't afford to do these things. Some people can't afford to wait for that waiting list to open up for them to have talking therapy or see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Yeah. So then they resort to what they can find in the here and now, which might be illicit drug use, which might be, getting it from somewhere more scrupulous.
Yeah. Chris, you kind of mentioned in your response, is there a bit of like is it quite challenging for clinicians and doctors to prescribe opioids? There's a lot of things that they have to take into consideration.
I'd say there's a range of approaches that are taken by doctors. There's kind of, in some cases, it's like a exploratory starting, managing an early kind of pain, like an acute pain. But particularly when you've got long-term chronic pain or like severe pain where, I've met people who've had to have sort of their legs amputated and they're in constant excruciating pain no matter what, and all of their nerves are firing off telling them, where's your legs? And it's kind of like the fire alarms going off in their body the entire time. And so from a doctor, you've got kind of like a couple of buckets of patient cohorts that you're sort of dealing with, and a bit of a spectrum of sensations. And well, it can be quite confusing as well for the general public to try and work out, like, what do we mean when we talk about pain? How do we relate to those different kinds of pain? Like, all those variations of pain all come under that same sort of umbrella of the same sensation. Opioids are great as those sort of first line of defense, initial sort of stepping stone, I suppose. But when it comes to those more extreme cases, it becomes very much a sort of like experimental form of medicine where you're just trying to provide some sort of relief that's sustainable to those patients and give them some degree of quality of life. Because in some cases, and again, I guess what's quite painful for doctors as well, you've got patients that are like, if you can't treat their pain, patients will talk about cutting the legs off or doing it themselves or amputating the finger that's rotten, for example. If you're in such bad pain, you'll do anything, and it becomes almost like a bit of an emotional situation as well that doctors have to regulate in that communication with patients in those scenarios. And I'd say opioids are like a nice, and especially the forms that opioids come in now with just a nice white pill, it's a very amenable way of providing a dose of a medication to a patient is something that the majority of the public have taken a pill. For the last 200 years, we've
Yeah.
taken pills more or less in some way, shape, or form. I say more or less, more so in the last 100 years. And so we almost then psychologically correlate taking a pill with a relief effect.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of like a psychological element to it as well. And yeah, completely right. There's the sensation of pain, but then there's also the emotional response to that physical pain or that emotional pain. When you've got a 15-minute consultation with a patient, it's just here, okay, you need to increase the dose potentially, or you've got this issue. And if you're a patient going through the NHS for years, you can very easily end up on a nice little menu of anything that the medical profession think or hope might also help you manage some of those symptoms. And yeah,
Yeah. It's what Karen you're talking about there. I guess like, people are just kind of put on opiates and it's 15-minute appointments and consultations.
Yeah.
It's not really the time or the breadth in the system to like have a real sit
You
down and
can't
kind of work out what's
dig
going on.
deeper
Yeah.
and get to the sort of root cause. Yes, you can have pain, you can have excruciating pain, but actually, there's an emotional side as well. That could have been triggered by something deeper. And we need to, people need to have the time to be able, but we're in that catch-22.
Yeah.
It's not available.
Yeah. Chris mentioned something as well that we talked about in a previous episode. It was kind of like the normalization of pills, like just taking pills. Everyone's really used to taking pills. And if you're prescribed a pill from a doctor, it feels very safe. It feels kind of like, well, I mean,
Totally.
it's been prescribed by the doctor, it's from the NHS, it's in this nice packet, it's in a pill, that can't be dangerous. And that's kind of a, Chris, you mentioned it is a recent thing in it that we kind of like just dishing pills out to solve all these problems, but we're giving pills to people to try and solve maybe more complex problems than people realise. And we talked previously about cannabis-based prescribed medicines and the reaction that has from the public around the method of consumption. It's very unfamiliar to people.
Yep.
Like flower-based medication is just so alien to a lot of people, whereas pills are just completely normal. So,
Totally.
people's perception, people's stigma around prescribed medicines is often based on their perception of what it looks like and kind of what we've said about a drug historically rather than the reality of a situation.
Yeah, I can't imagine my mother using a cannabis-based prescription medicine and vaping it. I mean, she wouldn't do it because it's not in a nice little capsule or a tablet. They want to be able to take it, walk away. They haven't got that smell.
Yeah.
Which is why we're releasing sort of new formulations and making it more accessible for that cohort of patients.
Yeah, that's really important. Chris, I've been really desperate to ask you this question, so I'm glad the time has come. Please tell us what's going on. So, like, what's going on with the endocannabinoid system? How on earth does that engage with pain? What's the relationship between the endocannabinoid system and people's experience of pain? How does it work?
basically from our brain, we've just got these strings that go throughout our body to all of our different tissues. So the organs, peripheries, fingers, and there's lots of different types of receptors and sensory cells that are at the end of those strings. And so all sort of centrally coordinated through the spine. And if you zoom in on those strings and on those cells, there's these little electrical circuits essentially which exchange chemicals, but there's also an electrical element to the exchange of those chemicals. So you can, for example, in the heart, you can measure the electricity coming off the heart. And in pain, we've got the normal functioning communications where it's like the cells are happy, there's no issues at the end of the nerves, my heart's happy, my intestines are happy. But if we experience, say, trauma to those tissues, either through sort of like an injury or like inflammation, if you've got arthritis in your hands, that will be sending a signal up to your brain. Or let's say you've got some cell damage where you've permanently burnt or broken something as a result. Maybe you've had an amputation, for example. There's going to be some degree of nerve damage there. And as well as that, that nervous system can sort of also malfunction and be sort of genetically potentially malfunctioned or have some kind of it may be traumatized in some way. And so there's a couple of different variations to how that circuitry can essentially malfunction, be damaged or impinged. And it's at those little electrical points of contact and interaction that opioids, cannabinoids start to take effect on the body. And so that's kind of where the chemicals in cannabis sort of touch the concrete, or the rubber hits the road when it comes to the sensations and the signaling. And so that's a little simplistic breakdown of pain and the sensation and how it all connects through the body. And essentially, opioids have kind of targeted that signaling. We have endogenous opioids that we produce. That kind of chemical interaction is what we're interpreting at a kind of biological, neurological level. And then cannabinoids are kind of like a new set of buttons that we found on this circuitry. Cannabis we've known about for kind of thousands of years, but it's only the last sort of 20, 30 years, maybe 40, where we've realized there's this new set of buttons that we can push in these sensory terminals where the communications happen, which is what we're targeting with cannabinoids now. And so it's the same physiology, but a different set of buttons and mechanisms that we can push with the chemicals and compounds in cannabis, and that we can also synthesize as well and synthetically target the receptors and enzymes and physiology around those sort of little bits of circuitry and those little synapses is what they're called basically. And so when it comes to a patient coming to you, you've got 15 minutes to work out where in that circuitry, what's going on, what have they tried so far, what are they doing wrong, what have they done already, what's working, what's not working. You can see why so many patients end up just sort of like disillusioned or not quite getting the full relief that they're sort of looking for. And pain's so multi-dimensional, you kind of need now multi-dimensional treatments, and a lot of conditions are very complex multi-dimensional sort of disorders and have very complex mechanisms. And I think the pill strategy is very binary, and it only pushes one or two buttons at a time, or maybe just pushes one button.
What does the research say about it, Chris? So what does the research say around cannabis-based prescribed medicines and how they, relate to pain-based conditions?
So there's kind of three key areas of research, or like stages to research, that we're sort of going through with cannabis at the moment, starting with just individual cells in a petri dish, where you're kind of applying cannabinoids to look at maybe what cellular signals are changing, for example, in that synapse. That tells us about the mechanisms and what buttons we can kind of push, and we've got a fairly good understanding of some of those mechanisms, but there's still a lot to be explored, and we don't have a massive amount of control really over some of those cellular interactions. So we can do it in cells, in a petri dish, in various different types of cells. You've then got rats, mice, dogs, monkeys, and the poor things that we sort of experiment on in quite a invasive way sometimes. So there's really good data in rat models and animal mice models to show that you can indeed reduce the number of tail licks and tail flicks and the experience of the rat pain in different simulated ways. So, and again, there's sort of a number of different ways you can torture a rat or mouse to simulate the pain of a human. But when it gets to actual human clinical trials, it's obviously completely different, and you're really relying off of sort of feedback from the patient, kind of self-reported subjective feedback, and you can't get as much of that objective detail that you can from a rat or a cell. We've got this baseline science, but now where the industry is and where research is, how do we turn that into formulations, synthetic molecules that precisely target the right mechanisms in humans? And so it's kind of like a bit of a translation process from those sort of primordial scientific studies to a then more advanced personalized precision treatment for real life living human patients that come to see you. And how do you do that quickly? How do you do that in a way that's personalized? And now we know you kind of need to everyone's unique, so you need to dial it in, and the pill doesn't offer that kind of solution or intervention at the moment. So cannabis is another angle that people are taking, and because we don't have that bridging research, vaporization's the crudest, most effective method, and people have smoked it prior to that. And so there are new formulations that researchers are looking at that are being validated, but those are just maybe making their way into the medical cannabis clinic ecosystem, but they're miles away from being accepted into the NHS formulary. And so there are a couple of drugs that are approved on there, but they're not quite pushing all the same buttons in the synapse that, again, most patients probably need or would like. So they're all kind of like individual small interventions within that complex ecosystem, as opposed to a kind of a entourage, is maybe the best term again for.
Yeah. You highlighted something that I've sort of realised quite early on in the medical cannabis sector, like obviously in 2018, when I was like deep into the campaigning world and the political lobbying. In 2018, I was like, oh, this is great. Like, we'll have it on the NHS in no time. This is like, do you know what I mean? Like, the walls have fallen.
Yeah.
Medical cannabis legal, like people say. But I obviously didn't come from a clinical background. I came from a treatment, criminology, crime and justice background, and had very little understanding of the processes that you have to go through, the length of research. And I'm passing no judgment on this. I'm just observing the reality of it, that you can have real world evidence, because drug science talk about this a lot. Drug science have been banging this drum for a long time, right? The impact of real world evidence, of people saying, my experience is this. I have this condition and I'm doing this, and here's my experience. Just real world. I'm telling you now. You don't need to torture any more rats. I'm telling you now, this is my experience. And how that just doesn't fit within our current clinical model in the NHS. That has no validation whatsoever. No. It needs years and years and years and years of research. And as you've kind of highlighted, Chris, very complex, very nuanced research. And I guess that's the interesting thing for me about the private sector. Like, it doesn't have to be an NHS versus private sector, although that would definitely be another podcast. But the NHS is a bureaucratic beast. Like, for anything to enter that system and find itself, prescribed to people, although COVID vaccines slightly different and under very different circumstances. Yeah. But I guess that's one of the strengths of the private sector, of private healthcare. It can operate in slightly different
yes, you've
boundaries.
Got much less restrictions. However, that comes at a price. And it's sad to see that, there's obviously so many people that would benefit from access to medical cannabis. But unfortunately, when you enter the private sector, that comes with a cost. If that was available on a service like the NHS, it would open it up so much for other people.
Yeah.
But we're a long way off.
Yeah.
Being able to be in that position.
Yeah. And I guess at this stage, something we said before on the other show was just awareness is the main thing. Just letting people know that there is choice, and letting people know that there are other forms of medicines available. There are other options. You don't have to go through an NHS model.
There's so much education that we could put out there, but unfortunately, because it's medical cannabis, you are blocked from being able to advertise or market that. So your voice is already been put down to a whisper.
What type of patients, when we're thinking about pain, then what type of patients would be considered? What type of patients would be able to have a conversation about getting a medical cannabis prescription?
So essentially all types of pain. So you've got chronic pain, acute pain. So as long as somebody has got a diagnosis of a condition and they've tried to conventional medications or surgery or talking therapy or counselling or physio, they can potentially be eligible. But we treat, patients with arthritic pain, chronic pain from injury or amputation, as Chris mentioned earlier, women's health, endometriosis, menopause, they all give off pain, or gastro, problems, Crohn's disease, multitude of pain conditions, although they don't necessarily fit the box of pain, but as a consequence, there is pain.
And just after trying two other medications?
Two
to qualify?
conventional medications, so not over the counter. So we wouldn't take on a patient that had tried paracetamol or ibuprofen for pain. They need to have tried two conventional pain medications, so maybe codeine-based or naproxen, or they've had physiotherapy, or they might have had a surgery. They would be classed as, they would then become eligible.
Chris, I saw something on LinkedIn earlier that was posted by Sarah Sinclair, who's ace. If you don't follow Sarah Sinclair, make sure you do. She's a great freelance journalist that covers medical cannabis. And she'd posted about a German biotech startup who would announce that new cannabis-derived drug, according to the research, worked better than opioids in clinical trials for chronic lower back pain. And a second phase 3 study, which included over 800 patients, found a larger reduction in pain levels, improved sleep quality and overall quality of life compared to a placebo. Is this the sort of thing that will help shift the dial in the discussion, or is that just, do we need to go much further in terms of building that evidence base and seeing changes here?
In short, yes. It's always better to have better quality clinical trial data with at least some control mechanisms in place. One thing that's kind of difficult or one thing that's kind of maybe holding back the wider research ecosystem with regards to sort of pain clinical trials, because there's been a good chunk of clinical trials that have taken place, but oftentimes every clinical trial is quite individual and quite variable. So it'll have different formulations that they're testing. It'll have different periods for which they're testing. So it might be just a couple of weeks. It might be just like 2 days with a short term of pain. It could be a long term trial. And I do remember having a look at this the other day. There's also always the element, and one thing that's popped up from some of our research was there's a lot of concerns around the risks of bias, particularly in the clinical trial setups. And there's a lot of discussion or a lot more scrutiny now on conflicts of interest, how the studies are set up, because the challenge is you can set up a study to basically show whatever you want it to show. And that's where the kind of like peer review process comes in, is other researchers and research groups scrutinize those papers. I think that's just been published, and 800 is a massive cohort, which is a great indication. I'm not sure if it's been fully published or peer reviewed yet, or which article, journal it's in, off the top of my head, but there are so many opportunities to make great formulations that do target specific conditions as well, and pain's a very general overarching topic, and something like lower back pain, that's also incredibly subjective. So just thinking kind of like critically, not to say this is the case in this study, like something like lower back pain, you can grade it and they will have used some kind of like pain grading scale, but it's also not as it's very subjective.
Talking to you, Chris, kind of reasserts for me the length of time by which cannabis-based prescribed medicines are going to stay in the private sector. I just can't, because you're making that point that, again, drug science make around real-world evidence of often those trials do include people whose real-world evidence is also historic. So, like, they come with a bit of a bias, a research bias, and then that calls everything into question. But yeah, it's such a long road. I see it's something that's just going to sit in the private sector.
Yeah, certainly for the foreseeable.
Do you get the impression, Karen, that like times are changing in terms of people's awareness of medical cannabis? A lot of people kind of talking about like sector growth, and there's been like levels of stagnation and frustration with the sector. But
I mean, I think it's certainly grown. I think, there's obviously a lot more clinics, so the sector must be growing for them to be more clinics opening. The product is more accessible than it was historically back in 2018. But I still think that there is a huge educational piece that is missing because we can't put it out there. I think if we were able to, I think the sector would exponentially grow.
Yeah, there is that limiting factor, isn't there? Because it sits within very deep and complex levels of compliance. It's
Yeah,
hard to get that
absolutely.
message out there. Do you think it's changing amongst doctors? What's your experience of clinicians and the doctors that are engaged with it? Is there sometimes a bit of an education piece there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, you've got certainly a lot of doctors that will not even entertain it. They don't want their patients, because we always communicate with the doctors, the NHS practices that our patients are linked to. We communicate every time that they've had a consultation to keep them in the loop from a health safety perspective. But we also ask consultants sometimes, are they happy for the patient to be prescribed medical cannabis alongside any current treatment they're having, particularly if they are oncology patients? We need to make sure that the doctor is on board with that. And sometimes it's a straight out no. And other times there is more flexibility. So I guess it depends on the doctor and their knowledge. Because I think that within the, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong here, within the endocannabinoid system, that hasn't always been part of a medical program for doctors learning to become doctors. I think it's something that is maybe touched upon now, the endocannabinoid side, but there was a big part where it wasn't. And then I think sort of older doctors, it was touched upon. So I don't know where that sits within the training programs now.
Yeah, I mean, to varying degrees around the country, different medical schools touch on it and interpret it in different ways. People will have probably heard of Sativex and Nabilone and Epidiolex, but they probably won't have been taught the full endocannabinoid system and how it integrates with the existing medical curriculum, basically. And it's kind of taught as like an adjunct add-on. And people will have heard varying degrees of that information. Because while I was doing my research, there was a lot of consultants who were diagnosing the cancers, sort of in the pathology clinics and going through what the tumors looked like, and they were on the cutting edge of what cancer treatments were available via the NHS. But when we were talking about, we're doing this study into like endocannabinoids, cannabinoid signaling, can it be effective using endocannabinoids as anti-cancer treatments? They had no idea. So I don't know if that gives you a good indication of sort of like where we're up to, yeah, and what, who knows what and where the understanding is. But there's always a bit of a delay, and I think lots of people don't really understand where the medical curriculum comes from as well. And typically, there's a large industrial influence on those curriculums as they're heavily invested in the universities and some of the research they do. And what gets translated from the medical research realm into those medical curriculums is very dependent on each of the medical schools and their kind of guidelines and their, again, do we want to teach doctors stuff that's maybe controversial? Most of them probably don't, because they don't have time anyway. Because again, like the medical curriculum is an incredibly like condensed, fast-paced course. Do we want to teach them about all this confusing, inconvenient stuff with cannabis and everything else? Probably not, and nor do we have time to. We'll focus on what's actually available on the NHS and like preparing doctors for the NHS as opposed to schooling them on the whole world of drug pharmacology and all the other like psychedelics, for example, as well, as something that aren't also haven't been integrated fully, or again to a degree, kind of like dietary education is not a massive part of the curriculum. It's very much physiology, functional anatomy, and then procedures for treating those, and then surgery specialties and specializing in different areas. So cannabinoids are a very small piece of what would be useful in the curriculum, but it then needs to be applied to all of these different specialties as well. So there's a bit of like a chronology to it. Interesting. Well, I think yeah, a good example, like one I guess Ozempic's a good example of like how a drug can just appear on the market overnight and with the right campaign, and if you find the right appeal in the right market, you so what those companies use is that this body of science, but how can we brand that, commercialize that, and turn it into something that doctors want to touch, doctors care about, they're interested in, that patients want, and it becomes like a full, almost like brand narrative as well around that launch of the drug. So in terms of like timelines, there's a couple of good campaigns probably, and a couple of good marketing initiatives is probably all it would take for it to be. It's already, if we look back 5 years ago, it was already mainstream enough to change the law in 2018. So I think another big initiative in a similar vein, and again, maybe it's Medical Cannabis Awareness Month this month. It just needs something to get the conversation going. Because I think nationally, if you've got the general talking points of the media, but if you can get something that's got a bit of societal traction and
It's a good example to make between the sort of Ozempic, really good point, Chris, and medical cannabis. But you can see why Ozempic did so well and the other GLP-1s now, because it had the backing of huge celebrities. You know, it was all over social media. It changed people's lives. It also saves the NHS a load of money because we're now getting people healthier by using that. But actually, medical cannabis can equally, obviously not the same benefits, but can benefit as well and reduce, you know, long-term drug use. It can reduce, you know, so many things that you then don't have to protect your stomach with taking other medications. And, you know, you don't have to take laxatives because you're on codeine and, you know, all these things. But we don't have that media surge behind it because we can't.
Yeah, it's very true. That is a great example. Ozempic is a great example, isn't it, of how something just went from like not prescribed, just like shot itself.
But again, you can't really get that so much on the NHS. It's certainly not as easy as, you know, but you've got pharmacies everywhere that are promoting it.
Yeah.
And everybody, literally everybody knows somebody that is taking it now.
Yeah, Chris, you're right, aren't you, as well, that like, you know, 2018, that there has been progress since 2018 and it is mainstream enough to kind of find itself where it is. Karen, at the clinic, there's obviously like a lot of stigma that exists around cannabis-based prescribed medicines, and people can be quite unfamiliar with a whole range of things around use of the medication. Do you find that soon changes once people are in a clinic and they've got that like clinical interaction? And
yeah, I think it depends on which clinic you go to, because there are obviously some clinics that just want you in for the prescription and happy to let you get on with it. And there's other clinics that will do educational pieces to walk it through with you, to help you understand and learn about it and to be there should you need any help. But I think that, you know, the more education we can bring into the clinics that we can share with the patients, the more comfortable they're going to be with the product and with the changes and the, you know, the effects that they then get from the medication.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, have you got any of the research that you've done that you wanted to share or talk about, which is relevant to this chat? Because I know it's definitely something you spent a lot of time working on.
So much of health can be improved, managed, and prevented just through general good quality of life, health education, and diet, sleep, water. And I think what doesn't get enough credit is just looking after yourself anyway, in general. Even if you've got a disease, even if you've got a health condition, if you can get out, get some fresh air every day, get the best possible sleep you can, don't use your phone till you're up late, don't drink Monster energy drinks all day every day, although they're great, taste great. Diet Coke, drinking Diet Coke all the time. I absolutely love it, but I notice very quickly, like, if I have too much of it, I notice a bit of a health impact. And I think a lot of the NHS workload and the patients that have to go into the NHS are and could be, they're kind of, we talk about this care in the community now, where it's nursing in the community, but we don't give the public or British citizens the tools to be able to like manage themselves. And it's kind of like that teach a man to fish kind of scenario where I think now in the modern world where there's information everywhere, that kind of like doctor patient interaction doesn't need to be as kind of like gatekeepy or as it was always kind of like a bit of a power relationship where the doctor knows everything and you surrender to the doctor, and what the doctor says best is what you go for. And it's kind of like that. Also, the saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, but keeping the right nutrition, if we can educate the public on good nutrition, good health practices, exercise, stretching, how to look after your human machine body, then we could save so much effort in the NHS. And we don't need a wonder drug, we don't need anything else. And we're very focused on a product or like a solution or like a thing to consume, a pill. And it's just normal. People want more of one thing. Like, oh, that made me feel good, I'll have more of it, and that'll make me feel more gooder. Not always the case, and often quite the opposite. And so having that, I think, and maybe this is a good platform for it, Paul, but and it's something that we've been looking at as well in the clinic with Karen. How can we maybe structure some of that information so the information is the preventative measure rather than having to give everyone Ozempic as a result down the line, just fat jab everyone? Could we have prevented that with early education in schools, better diets, better sleep information? No one teaches you how to look after your body in school.
It's also, we are such a culture now of laziness. We don't want to put effort in. We don't want to go to the gym and exercise. We want a jab, or one jab fits all.
Instant gratification.
Yeah. But actually, that's what we need. We need to be getting the kids in school doing more sport. We need to be kids in secondary school doing more sport instead of getting a phone attached to their hands, you know?
Yeah, agree. It's a powerful message. I like that.
Yeah.
Agree.
But it is true. If you look at if I look at my kids today, they are so consumed by a mobile phone, junk, rubbish food, staying up late, and everything has changed from when I was a kid and you would come home from school, you would go out and play with your mates. You wouldn't sat at home in front of the TV. And again, for the generation before that, you didn't have it. You ate vegetables and meat and drunk milk and had water, and everything wasn't in packaging and plastics. And we're we're lazy.
And I think one of the great things about the internet and about content is people are becoming more aware of that and alternatives out there. I think there is. Obviously the work, some of the side projects that I do, working with kids at colleges and stuff and universities, it is shocking how much close the phone is to the eyes all the time. But I think there is a bit of an awakening around the harms of that, and an awakening around the alternatives to mainstream health, NHS. Like, there are other things you can do, there are other guidance you can take to kind of change that relationship that you talked about, Chris, was kind of like, just take the thing, just take the pill, just take the whatever, and just carry on your way. There are other options, other things you can do.
And I'd say to that, Paul, it's the only tool that doctors have really is to dispense a pill. They're not really given much. They can't prescribe a dietary intervention. They can't say, hey, look, you just eat French fries every day. Here's a meal subscription that does your food for you. Or what else could there be? But again, that would probably be a more sustainable alternative to the just Ozempic jab.
Yeah.
Or we'll give you a gastric band. Like that, those are such invasive things. And I think you're right, Karen, there is a culture around and we've almost been conditioned, and that's like the cultural norm now, is that you just, rather than adjust anything, look at the big picture, maybe look at your behavior, what am I doing? It's like, oh, I'll just buy that, or I'll just consume that, or I'll just do this. And we just end up in like you say, a bit of a shortcut. Private medicine's, it's got an opportunity to do something really well and kind of show how you can maybe do a more sustainable version of the quality of service you get from the NHS, but also there is kind of it's becoming a bit outdated, I think, and everyone can kind of see that the NHS is like old, kind of
Yeah.
worn out, needs ideas, and it's very focused on like a magic drug as opposed to like half of you shouldn't have to be here. You've kind of done it to yourself, or you've got like a simple thing in your lifestyle that's causing this, or again, you've had some emotionally traumatic event. You don't need SSRIs. You've been assaulted. You've got PTSD from a very traumatic event. You don't need strong drugs just to neutralize it. You need to kind of have like you need to be rehumaned almost. Yeah, we're a long way away from like a tribe once upon a time where everyone would like hunt, eat together, and like everyone would do stuff together. Whereas now you're very much on your own. You watch your screen, you sit in your room, and I'm talking about young people mainly here at the moment. But you drink your
Yeah.
Monster Energy drink, you watch your propaganda for the day or your media information, and you just kind of like disassociate from like, oh well, I need to brush my teeth, have a shower, eat nice food, see nice people, go to nice places, and like have a good experience really. And I think that's reflected in the state of the NHS at the moment. Is like the quality of life of the British people is atrociously poor for the most majority, who are underslept, overworked, financially stressed, don't see the kids enough. And I think well, the politicians are always going to say, oh well, it's the Tories' fault, it's this, that, or the other. But
Oh gosh, yeah.
there's
But it's
a
not
there's a
going to
lot more that
change.
could be done constructively if it wasn't just like political parties pointing at each other the whole time and like just thinking about big picture solutions, maybe like simple changes that don't require a big, well, exchange of cash or a nice contract with the government or something, for example, which is kind of like the new norm.
Yeah, but I think it'll be impossible to change because unless you stop everything and start again from fresh, how can you change inherent behaviour?
Yeah. Agree. And it's sort of like my interactions or experience with the NHS is everything is just about time. It's all about time. It's about what's the
Yeah.
quickest, most efficient, seeing
Yeah.
you next person thing. And like a lot of the things that you're both talking about is a much more holistic, zoomed out way of looking at someone's experience, whether it be of pain or whatever else. It's like, okay, yeah, you're in pain, but like, let's zoom out for a minute. Okay, this is what's going on.
Yeah.
Whereas the NHS is just like, right, there you go. Right, next, go, 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 go.
But I don't think it's I don't think it's anything from the doctors, because I think the doctors, certainly the ones that I meet regularly, the ones that might work in our clinic, they want to help. They want to do good, but they are restricted by the boundaries of what they have to practice in. So I think that we've got amazing clinicians out there, so good, that really want to make a difference, but have their hands tied. We just
And
need
maybe
to
add one
set them
final
through.
thing to that as well, build on what Karen mentioned there and yourself, Paul. Right now, there's kind of like two approaches that we can sort of see. There's the scientific, innovative approach of let's create something, develop something here's the 5 problems, here's a solution that solves all 5 of those in a nice, efficient, even better, more effective way. Whereas I think the NHS has fallen for that like consulting management strategy of just like cut the fat, do the time, get the numbers, and it's just become more of like a management consultancy national health service as opposed to like the scientists, innovators. We've got the smartest people in the world. Why have we got the slowest, oldest, scruffiest NHS processes, if that makes sense? So I guess that was my final thought, something that was like scratching at me as well. Because I think, again, from what I hear from everyone that works in the NHS has complained to no end about some sort of management issues, or it's just about the money, it's just about the time, and it's never how can we create, fix it, make something. It's eliminate and cut.
Yeah.
And I think,
Yeah.
that's kind of like where we've got to, and I guess that's a whole British government thing anyway. But it's the management consultancy approach to the NHS and health is, I think that's what kind of encroached on the health journey, I suppose, because they won't know that. They'll just think, oh, we've got to shave those numbers down. We've got to cut those funds and pump those numbers if we can. So in the nicest
Agree.
possible way.
If you look at even pain clinics, pain consultants, you know, they are cutting them back. You know, there's less pain consultants than there probably was 5 years ago working in the NHS, because they leave and they might go into the private sector, and then they're not replacing them. So, you know, your NHS GP, so let's take somebody that, you know, takes a sleeping tablet. You know, they will issue them one every 28 days. So they only get one script per month. They have to go back, but only after a certain period of time. They won't do it anymore because it is an addictive medication. So then they'll get referred to a pain clinic, but actually you can't get an appointment at a pain clinic. You know, there's less pain consultants or doctors now. So then you're stuck in this loop. You're stuck in no man's land. You can't get the prescription. You can't see a pain consultant. So what's your next option? Is to seek drugs from unworthy sources, because you need that. You need to sleep. So we're in this catch-22, and how do we get off that hamster wheel? Like Chris said, you know, we need an exit.
I really enjoyed the discussion. I like how broad we went. We kind of got into the opioid crisis that we have in the UK. What's going on there? Why is there such normalisation of opiate use? Chris, you talked in great detail, eloquently, about what's actually going on. How's that endocannabinoid system? Kind of giving a fantastic overview of what we're seeing in clinics, what we're seeing in the kind of the front line, and some of those changing shifts that we're seeing in terms of people's experience of cannabis-based medicines, getting away from opiates. So thanks both for the conversation. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to find out about Lyphe Clinic or about any of the research that we discussed, about the work that Chris does, check out the description below where you will find all the links. And like, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.